Hello and welcome. I'm Charles Langley, the Executive Director of PublicWatchdogs.org in San Diego. I'm also a public advocate. I started my career in 1996 at UCAN, the Utility Consumers Action Network, which was created as a project of the University of San Diego's Center for Public Interest Law by Dr. Robert Felmuth. Today, we are here to talk about what's really going on at the failed San Onofre nuclear generating station, known as SONGS. You will also meet three amazing people who are helping to pave the way to a better, safer nuclear world. Those speakers are Kathy Iwani, Paul Blanche, and Gary Hedrick of San Clemente Green. But before I introduce them, let me give you a quick overview of the situation at San Onofre. San Onofre is located next to the I-5 freeway on the Orange County-San Diego border. More than 8.5 million people live within a 50-mile radius. This site is located directly on top of an earthquake fault. And you can see the fault map there. According to the federal government's USGS, that's the U.S. Geological Survey, SONGS is also located in a tsunami inundation zone. The red notch shows the floodplain, which is also the location of 3.5 million pounds of nuclear waste. And by the way, they're stored in canisters. You'll see them tonight. And they're just a foot or two above the water level, the water table. SONGS is also located on a military base. And we bring this up because it's located at Camp Pendleton and because it's on a military base, it is a legitimate military target under the rules of war in a time of war. Finally, the beachfront San Onofre nuclear waste dump is only 108 feet from the ocean. So what's the problem? Well, according to the USA's first and most highly respected science journal, Scientific American, the plutonium at San Onofre is deadly to all human life for at least 250,000 years. And if you get within a few feet of an unshielded canister, you will probably be dead in a few hours. And that's because these canisters have very thin walls. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, this is the view of the nuclear waste dump, looking at it from the east out toward the west. And they call it an ISFSI, an independent spent fuel storage installation. This is what it looked like before they laid down the final coat of concrete. And this is what it looks like now. Now this is the actual brand of canister being used at San Onofre to store radioactive nuclear waste. It's a Holtec MPC-37 or multi-purpose canister that has not yet been welded shut. Each of those egg crate holes will actually hold a nuclear waste spent fuel assembly. So this is another view. The walls on these canisters are 5/8 of an inch thick. Now, compare that last thin-walled canister to an actual nuclear waste storage cask from Nuclear Waste Assurance Corporation. These make the thin-walled casks look like a third world solution, don't they? This is a picture of the spent fuel that's inside each canister. A lot of people have the idea that it's some kind of goo or glowing liquid, but fuel rods are made of metal and a bundle of them makes up a spent fuel assembly. And what's so crazy about nuclear fuel is that it's really harmless before it goes into the nuclear reactor. And when it comes out, it's absolutely deadly. Now, Once the canister is welded shut by robots in a refrigerated deep water pool, it is placed in an overpack canister like this one to shield the workers from deadly radiation. Then it's wheeled out onto the nuclear waste dump, the ISFC, with super heavy-duty equipment. Each fully loaded canister weighs more than 100,000 pounds. One thing you should know is that these canisters are sizzling hot when they're fully loaded. And if you get within a few feet of an unshielded canister, you're in trouble. What we're seeing here, of course, is a canister with a heavy overpack. Now, the cans are cooled with convection air cooling on the outside of the canister, which rests inside these silos. One of our next speakers, Paul Blanche, has expressed concerns about what would happen if water actually gets into that narrow aperture and starts to boil violently. This is what you see if you fly over the dump with a drone. But this is what I see. And the reason I see eggs is because of a study in proportional mathematics conducted by Ace Hoffman. You see, if you shrink one of these thin-walled cans down to the size of an egg, the stainless steel wall would literally be eggshell thin. And that's a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because during the downloading process with those heavy canisters going into those steel silos, they got scratched. In fact, every single canister at Songs is either scratched or gouged from tip to toe. You can see an example of a scratch on the left. The can on the right has what looks like a mineral deposit, but what that actually is the beginning of something called stress corrosion cracking. And if you see, if you talk to a metallurgist, they'll say, yes, this is chloride stress corrosion. But it gets worse. Discovery documents, court documents uncovered by Donna Gilmore of San Onofre Safety.org, excuse me, that's sanonofresafety.org, show that the canisters only have a 25-year warranty, and that the UMAC system, which is what they call this entire nuclear waste dump, or ISFC, is, with all the silos, it's only warranted for 10 years. So to summarize, the nuclear waste is deadly for at least 250,000 years. It's being stored 108 feet from the beach in a tsunami inundation zone on top of an earthquake fault. It is a legal military target in the event of war, and it is within a 50-mile plume radius identified by the NRC that contains 8.5 million people. So this concludes my portion of this presentation. And next up is Paul Blanche. Mr. Blanche, are you ready to speak?
I am, as soon as you provide an introduction, so many people can hear me.
Oh, yes. Paul Blanche is a nuclear engineer with more than 50 years of experience with regulatory issues and safety concerns at nuclear power plants. As a safety advocate, his goal is to make certain that nuclear plants are operated safely and in compliance with the law. Mr. Blanche has extensive experience with the decommissioning of nuclear power plants. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Blanche.
Thank you, Charles, for that kind introduction. And I am going to be running, well, our host is going to be running the slides, and I'm going to be making a formal presentation. And we see here slide one, which is the beginning, and my presentation is actually broken up into two parts. Thank you and good evening. As a nuclear engineer with over 50 years of experience, I would say that the San Onofre nuclear station, or SONGS, is probably the most dangerous nuclear power plant in the USA. I'm saying this as a lifetime advocate of safe nuclear power. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's, or NRC, mission is to protect the public and the environment. That's their sole mission. This mission is accomplished allegedly by compliance and enforcement with the federal regulations. I've been a qualified reactor operator, instructor of reactor theory and operations, and a qualified nuclear electrician, and more than 4 years of formal nuclear education. Additionally, I received a BS degree in engineering and was a professional engineer in the state of California. I have participated in many nuclear decommissioning boards, or refer to them as DOBs, in the Northeast in the United States. The NRC's Office of the Inspector General has issued at least 3 investigative reports over the years validating my interactions with the NRC. All of these OIG reports substantiated my contentions that the NRC provided false information to me and to the public. The NRC continues this practice, and we have been meeting with the OIG on an ongoing basis about the issues we will be discussing today. The OIG reports can be located on the NRC's website. I'd just like to mention that we have personally met with Robert Vitale, who is the Inspector General and was appointed by the President. I will be citing specific regulations from the Federal Code of Regulations, I'll refer to as CFR, but will not burden the audience with specific and confusing terms such as 10 CFR 72.122, parentheses, L, etc. These can all be found on the NRC's website or Google. Next slide, please. Now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, has a responsibility and a mission to protect the public and the environment. That's their sole mission. But I'm sorry to say that's not happening here, and everyone in Southern California needs to know that and know what the problems are. That is my goal tonight. Next slide, please. So the question before us tonight is, how can we make San Onofre decommissioning safer? We will never make it completely safe, but there are things we can do to make it safer than it is now. And it's critical to do that before it's too late. Next slide. This is an overall photo taken from the south side of the plant. The major issues we're going to be talking about tonight are the potential flooding of San Onofre during a tsunami or major weather event, and a clear unaddressed issue of potential criticality, which I will explain later, a clear requirement of the regulations. We'll be talking about the failures of political communication after Fukushima accident, and the failure and the transparency of the NRC Southern California, or Edison, and Holtec, a subcontractor to Edison, about the true dangers of San Onofre. We're going to be talking about the retrievability, another federal requirement. We're going to be talking about the potential consequences should the NRC continue to ignore its regulations and congressional mandate. Next slide. Here are some pictures demonstrating the proximity of San Onofre to the ocean and the very likely possibility that in a severe storm or tsunami, the area where the spent fuel is currently located could become submerged in salt water from the Pacific. Keep in mind the facility is in an earthquake zone, so the idea of a tsunami is not remote. The wall that you see here is the only thing protecting the spent fuel containment area. This wall will not even protect against normal wave actions. One can also view the San Onofre thick, 1 foot thick seawall, which will provide no protection. Last month, I was fortunate enough to visit the Canary Islands, and this photo was taken of a seawall designed to protect a small harbor in a small city of about 50,000 people. It's about 12 feet thick at the top, 50 feet thick at the bottom. This is also similar to the seawall at Fukushima, which unfortunately did not consider the potential magnitude of historic tsunamis. Next photo. This is a photo from the owners of the plant, Edison. Shows the area that would be flooded in the event of a major weather event. As you can see, the area clearly marked is exactly where the spent fuel is presently being stored. So everyone knows this is a problem. A storage facility may be flooded at an ever-increasing frequency with climate change. Edison submitted this photo under oath to the NRC in 2013, and it has never been supplemented or withdrawn. Next slide, please. Now, the NRC has decided that the possibility of a flood at San Onofre is not credible without ever defining what not credible means. So they don't have a plan for flooding. The NRC's own documentation actually says, quote, flooding is excluded as an initiating event, close quote. In spite of Edison's own analysis, and Holtec, the company subcontract to Edison to decommission San Onofre, classifying its analysis of flood potential as proprietary information. How can information critical to the safety of millions of people be classified as proprietary? It appears that Edison is hiding and withholding vital information from the public and the government and elected officials. Next slide, please. Let me talk a few minutes about the way the spent fuel is currently stored and cooled at San Onofre and why it could be a major problem in the event of a flood. The canister containment device is designed to keep the spent fuel cool. Here's how it's designed to work. And I'm going to go off script a little bit and show the canister, which is the gray thing on the left. That's the canister. The whole system is referred to as a vertical ventilation module, and the canister is on the inside. And I want you to remember that the fuel level here is quite a bit below the top of the VVM. The 5/8-inch canisters, each containing more radioactive material than released from either Fukushima or Chernobyl, are located about 108 feet from the Pacific Ocean. During normal operation, the airflow enters the top as shown by the blue arrows and proceeds down the outside of the divider shell as shown. From there, it passes through small passages estimated to be about 4 inches in height at the bottom. And due to the heat, rises and discharges the heated air, thus cooling the canisters. The normal temperature on the outside of the canister, the gray matter we see here, is around 500 degrees. I expect the discharged air to be a few hundred degrees, but we do not have that information. I've described the operation of the cask and cooling during design and normal operations. It may function well in a dry, salt-free environment. However, San Onofre, the life expectancy is limited and carries only a 25 or 10-year warranty, as discussed by Charles. There's a problem, as acknowledged by Edison and Holtec, that flooding may occur under storm conditions and also due to the effect of tsunami. Either of these events will result in the flooding of these vertical ventilation modules. In this event, water, debris will inundate these modules, filling all cooling paths and module voids. Should this occur, specific seawater with about 3% salt will flood all the voids in these modules. As clearly stated by the NRC and Holtec, the water will actually assist with the cooling because convection will occur unless the bottom is blocked. When the water recedes, the seawater will rapidly boil off due to the heat of the spent fuel and the latent heat of the vertical ventilation models. In a few hours or minutes, all the water will be boiled off, leaving a few hundred pounds of solidified salt and other debris at the bottom, covering the airflow paths. And we've estimated the height of the salt, cake salt, which will be crusted and hard, will probably be in the range of 8 to 10 inches high. The salt will totally inhibit all cooling to the spent fuel. Edison states they can remove this blockage, but this statement is absolutely false, especially for 73 canisters. Edison has not acknowledged having procedures or equipment in place to remove blockages within 24 hours, as required by the legally binding technical specifications. This is not trivial and a very expensive endeavor, nor has the NRC required such equipment or training for these procedures. The loss of canister heat removal has been analyzed by Holtec and the NRC. However, it assumes that cooling will be restored to all 73 canisters within 24 hours, which cannot possibly be done. One cannot remove that blockage even within a day. So we're talking 73 days for potential increase in the consequences of an accident. The loss of heat removal for greater than 24 hours has never been analyzed and will result in exceeding fuel and canister design limits with unknown radiological consequences. It is also possible the material's design criticality could be damaged. And I want to go off script a little bit. Criticality is a major concern, which I'll get into, but there are plates with a proprietary name, Metamax, I believe it is, by Holtec. We have no idea what it's made of, but it's inserted in there along the fuel to absorb neutrons and prevent criticality. We have no idea what will happen to this neutron absorbing material. We have no data whatsoever. Next slide, please. The NRC has developed what they call a probabilistic risk assessment of dry cask storage system at a nuclear power plant. In this report, they project a dose of 360 millirems of radiation to the public, extending out to 1 mile. I know this is meaningless to most people. The maximum allowable dose to the public is 100 millirems. So we have a problem, and it means that everyone within a 1 mile radius would have to be relocated or some other protective action in a flooding event, just as they were at Fukushima. The NRC hasn't done or hasn't made public any analysis of the exposure to the public beyond 1 mile. This is another reason we need a site-specific analysis for a flooded and potentially breached spent fuel canister. The NRC has determined that such a breach is not credible, but won't define not credible. But we believe it's very credible and requires a revised emergency action plan. At the time to develop that plan is now, not once we have an emergency on our hands. Next slide, I'm talking about eventual inadvertent criticality. No commercial reactor in the world has ever experienced this type of event, but it did occur at a military reactor called SL-1 in Idaho in 1961, resulting in immediate fatalities and land still uninhabitable today. In September 1965, I commenced my first day at Admiral Rickover's Navy Nuclear Power School. At the time, I hardly knew the difference between a neutron and a crouton. On this first day, we were all gathered to view a classified video on the Army's inadvertent criticality accident at SL-1 in Idaho. This accident produced a peak pressure of 10,000 pounds and resulted in 3 immediate fatalities and an unspecified number of latent deaths. The amount of contaminated land has never been published, to my knowledge. We all understood the message. This video can be readily viewed on Google or on Wikipedia. Our instructor that day reminded us, and I will never forget it, that we are not dealing with a cookie factory, but a dangerous system if not properly understood, maintained, and operated in accordance with approved procedures. The results can be catastrophic. Slide 13. Federal regulations for criteria, criticality, safety state in part, and I won't give you the number. Spent fuel handling package, transfer, and storage systems must be designed to be maintained subcritical for handling, packaging, transfer, and storage conditions, and in the nature of the immediate environment under accident conditions. This analysis has never been done. The only analysis that has been supplied to the public states that we guarantee it won't go critical as long as the water level is at 95%. If you remember the previous drawings, we don't know whether it's 95% of the fuel height, which I believe it is, or 95% of the canister height. But they're essentially acknowledging that if we have a ruptured canister, there is a possibility of a criticality. An inadvertent criticality is not credible for inland sites, but an unaddressed possibility is Onofre with unimaginable consequences. Once again, Edison fails to provide any realistic analysis of the event. As I mentioned before, Holtec states that criticality will not occur as long as the water in the canister level is less than 95%, whatever that means, but fails to discuss total flooding, inferring that total flooding may result in multiple criticalities. We don't know if this is the water level in the canister or the fuel that are significantly different. Holtec uses a proprietary material called Metamix to absorb neutrons and prevent criticality. We have no information on this material and its ability to remain functional at temperatures during the loss of cooling and other events that exceed the design limits. The required analysis must also consider the event and its consequences. I know I've said a lot in a few minutes, but now I'll be back later, but I'm going to thank you for listening and now return the presentation back to Mr. Langley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Just to clarify something, if you don't know what the term criticality means, it just means it's a sustained nuclear reaction.
Well, a criticality is, yes, a sustained, uncontrolled nuclear reaction that the only thing that will stop it is when the fuel disintegrates and disperses. That will stop the criticality, and that's what stopped it at SL-1.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Catherine Iwani. Miss Iwani is a businesswoman, an educator, and a Fukushima evacuee. A mother of two, Kathy Iwani taught English in Wakayama, Japan for 25 years. She completed her postgraduate work and co-founded Gaia English Academy in 1990. After experiencing the Fukushima meltdowns in March of 2011, Kathy and her husband decided to evacuate their children to San Diego in April of 2012. In an ironic twist of fate, Kathy moved to San Diego one day before the San Onofre generating station's 2012 radiation leak. Kathy, you may proceed.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, I'm Kathy Iwane. Tonight I speak to you as someone who experienced firsthand the Fukushima triple nuclear meltdowns in Japan. I'll share a bit of what happened and the aftermath of the disaster to illustrate the importance of transparency, honesty, and public dialogue by those in positions of authority. Next, please. As Paul mentioned, there's 1,800 tons of high-level nuclear waste stranded 108 feet from the Pacific Ocean at San Onofre. It's not a power plant anymore. It's the San Onofre nuclear waste site. Next, please. This isn't just a San Onofre problem. There are more than 60 nuclear waste sites like this all over the US. Decades ago, the Department of Energy promised to collect all this high-level nuclear waste and consolidate it into a permanent national repository by 1998. They charged us, the taxpayers, billions of dollars to develop Yucca Mountain into a repository. Yucca Mountain was canceled for geological and political reasons, but the Department of Energy kept the money. Now San Onofre and other waste sites like it are stuck with the waste and the risk, but without the money and without consent. Next, please. The Japanese archipelago is roughly the same size as California, with a population of about 125 million people. When the tsunami hit Japan, our hometown of Wakaoda, Wakayama, a full 380 miles southwest of Fukushima, saw 500 citizens evacuate to the gymnasium of my daughter's elementary school due to flooding and damage to their homes. Next, please. Japanese citizens were told by their government that they were in no immediate danger, but I found myself translating US military and US embassy orders for Americans to evacuate Tokyo, which is 186 miles from Fukushima. I was shocked by the lack of transparency exhibited by the Japanese government, and I evacuated from Japan after 25 years with my kids to California, leaving my children to support us for 7 years. Lack of transparency, lack of clarity, and virtually no public engagement has cost Japan severely. Next, please. The Japanese economy has tanked. 12.1 trillion yen, the equivalent of about $93 billion spent so far on the nuclear disaster. 300,000 people evacuated. 50,000 homes were directly affected by the radioactive material released into the soil, the air, and the sea. Prime Minister Naoto Kan, in power at the time, tells us that had it not been for the prevailing offshore winds sweeping half of the radioactivity out to sea, he would have had to evacuate Tokyo, a city of 14 million people, which would have created warlike conditions. Next, please. Living 380 miles from Fukushima at our home in Wakayama, since scintillators, which measure radioactivity in foods, cost thousands of dollars and were not readily available in 2011. We noticed our Geiger counter ringing with elevated radioactivity in milk, leafy greens, and fish, which were produced or harvested in northeastern Japan. So the movement to farm and eat locally became very, very important. It wasn't the fear of irradiated food as much as the apathetic consciousness of teachers who told our daughters not to tell their friends why they had opted out of school lunches with milk and rice sourced near Fukushima. So instead, my girls took a bento made daily by me, sourced with locally grown foods. Next, please. This is Takazushiyama. The top of this mountain is the destination for evacuation from our girls' school, Wakaura Elementary School, with the path going past our home. During the tsunamis, we prepared water, bathrooms, and toilet paper in the event that of the 400 kids evacuating, some would be in need. Next, please. After Fukushima blew, the Japanese government started a campaign to pay cities all over the country to incinerate radioactive debris left over from the accident in unfiltered incinerators at local waste centers. Burning radioactive debris to ash does nothing to decrease radiation dose. In fact, burning it spreads it around and concentrates it further. This national campaign was sold to the people as, quote unquote, sharing the burden of Fukushima. My husband and I assembled a coalition, and we were lucky with friends to successfully prevent our city and prefectural governments to refuse this burning of radioactive rubble at our local waste center, which, not coincidentally, was right next to schools and agriculture. When nearby Osaka City started burning this debris, we made the difficult decision to evacuate our daughters to California. Next, please. The Japanese government was deceptive as we witnessed lawmakers arbitrarily raise the standard for acceptable and, quote, safe levels of radiation in food. The Japanese parliament did this without producing any scientific studies or risk assessments to the public. Suddenly, Japanese politicians enacted standards which made it legal to give infants 2 times the previous levels determined for nuclear waste. And this went into their powdered formula and other beverages. Next slide, please. In 2013, Prime Minister Abe enacted the State Secrets Law, which classified important security concerns. However, it put whistleblowers and journalists at risk for prison terms of up to 10 years for seeking or publishing such information. The Japanese government denied this. However, it's common knowledge that reports about radioactive contamination were being scrubbed from social media. Next, please. So what does Fukushima have to do with San Onofre? Everything. A report from the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace should make everyone think twice about the assurances of safety coming from the NRC. The report says, and I quote, "The Fukushima accident was preventable. Had the plant's owner, Tokyo Electric Power Company, and Japan's regulator, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, followed international best practices and standards, it is conceivable that they would have predicted the possibility of the plant being struck by a massive tsunami." Next, please. We're on the next one. The International Atomic Energy Commission concurred, stating, when the flooding hit, the tsunami walls made to protect the plant from such events were too low to prevent the seawater from entering the plant. The water strength destroyed some of the structures and entered the diesel generator room, which was built lower and at a closer distance to sea level than other plants in Japan. So, the unthinkable happened. The event that wasn't likely happened. The thing that all the planners said would never happen, happened. And people died, and they continue to die. Next, please. In 2012, I read this very, very important geological paleoseismic study authored by Gerald G. Kuhn. This study, backed by more than 20 independent geological reports, reveals a history of tsunamis along the coast south of San Onofre. The evidence shows tsunamis with wave heights of up to 300 plus feet above the current perimeter of lagoons and estuaries in North County, San Diego, where the waste site is now located in an official tsunami inundation zone. The author of this study postulates that the offshore Newport, Inglewood, Rose Canyon fault systems and submarine canyon landslides were responsible for these tsunamis. You would think that this highly respected scientific study would be referenced in Southern Cal Edison's licensing agreement for the waste site, but you would be wrong. This study was sent to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but they buried it. It has been erased from their files. Nobody wants that smoking gun in their files when something terrible happens. So we have our mineral markers at San Onofre, proof of devastating tsunamis at the site. This is our memorial to tsunami devastation in Southern California. Next, please. In Japan, we find a different kind of memorial. This is a stone slab, often erected on Japan's coastline, warning future generations to protect them from tsunamis. The stone reads, "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point," unquote. This was the advice the dozen or so households of the village of Aneyoshi they heeded this advice, and their homes emerged unscathed from the Fukushima disaster, which flattened low-lying communities elsewhere and killed thousands along Japan's northeastern shore. Next, please. Many experts have warned that Fukushima was vulnerable, just as we are doing tonight with San Onofre. Dr. Katsuhiko Ishibashi, a seismologist and former member of Japan's Nuclear Safety Commission, argued in a 2007 report that the Daiichi plant was vulnerable to major earthquakes and tsunamis, and that the safety measures in place were inadequate. The Japan Society of Civil Engineers published a report in 2008 warning that Japan's nuclear power plants were not sufficiently protected against earthquakes and tsunamis. In Dr. Hiroaki Koide's 2008 book, Genpatsu no Shinjitsu, The Truth About Nuclear Power Plants, co-authored by Jinzaburo Takagi, argued that Japan's nuclear power plant operators were not doing enough to ensure their safety. A former nuclear engineer for Toshiba, who actually worked on the design of the Fukushima Daiichi plant, Masashi Goto, criticized the design of its reactors and cooling systems. He argued that the reactors were too small and lacked the necessary safety features to prevent a catastrophic accident. Next, please. So here we go again. San Onofre safety advocates have jumped through hoop after hoop to engage the NRC, our federal regulator, and the owners of San Onofre on one crucial point of contention. We need the NRC to provide the risk assessments showing how they would handle the nuclear waste at San Onofre in the event of flood or tsunami and other things. As Mr. Blanche will demonstrate shortly, they can't possibly meet the recommended procedures for an emergency at San Onofre. It's not physically possible. And yet, there's no plan B on site at San Onofre in case of an accident. Off-site emergency plans are null and void, and this is due to exemptions given from the NRC to Southern Cal Edison. Next, please. Here in California, we are experiencing extreme weather events which no scientists have predicted. Massive flooding with numerous sinkholes, coastal bluff and cliff devastation, destruction. Homes are just being thrashed by storms, 8 feet of snow in Lake Tahoe earlier this spring, not to mention total blackouts and whiteouts in communities surrounding the Los Angeles basin. These are things we've never seen before, highly unusual events which we now need to prepare for. It's high time that the NRC engage the public transparently on all of the climate change evidenced risks. Next, please. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to answering your questions during Q&A. Charles, I hand it back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. We're getting a lot of really great questions in the chat room, and we'll hopefully be able to address all of them. What's going to happen next is Paul Blanche is going to speak, then Gary Hedrick from San Clemente Green, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. But I want to say, while we get Paul's slide deck ready, that one of the reasons I truly admire Paul Blanche and consider him to be a personal hero is because he had the courage to risk everything as a whistleblower at a nuclear power plant back in the 1990s. Paul blew the whistle because the company was refusing to acknowledge important safety issues involving radiation and natural gas pipeline safety. The story was front page news with national implications and resulted in lasting reforms. Mr. Blanche, you may continue to part 2 of your presentation.
Okay, thank you again, Charles, and thank you, Kathy, for your phenomenal presentation. This is the second part, and I'm going to be addressing 2 different other regulations that I didn't totally cover in part 1. This first photo shows the power of the Pacific Ocean in the vicinity of San Onofre. This part of my presentation is about the federal regulation that requires the retrievability of spent fuel at San Onofre, and we'll also cover a little bit more on criticality. These are regulations that have been just totally ignored by Edison and by the NRC, and of course by Holtec. Next slide. Retrievability is one of the most vital aspects of the safe storage of spent fuel in a storage facility at San Onofre and other existing storage sites. This definition is essentially one sentence, and it's very clear. And it's mandated. There's no excuse for not complying with it. And it says retrievability. Storage systems, which we have 120 some, must be designed to allow ready retrieval of a spent fuel, not the canister, but the spent fuel, high-level radioactive waste, and reactor-related GTCC, which stands for greater than Class C waste, for further processing and disposal. And the same Part 72 regulation states, except as specifically authorized by the Commission in writing, no interpretations of the meaning of these regulations in this part by any officer or employee of the Commission, other than written interpretation by the General Counsel, will be recognized as binding on the Commission. Again, the NRC Commission has ignored this. The next slide. The NRC, with the assistance of industry lobbying groups such as the Nuclear Energy Institute, has made every effort to change this regulation and avoid major financial impact on utilities by a concerted effort to change the interpretation, avoiding the long formal rulemaking process described in Part 2 of the regulations. Compliance for each plant would be would add tens of millions to the decommissioning costs. In direct conflict with these regulations of the law, the NRC has developed a sneaky workaround. With full knowledge, the NRC has essentially changed the intent of the retrievability regulations to allow sites to meet this law by demonstrating that the canister, not the fuel, storage is acceptable without the ability to ever access the spent fuel, thus saving billions of dollars for the nuclear industry. No need for a hot cell or a spent fuel pool. The NRC did all this behind closed doors. However, it was eventually published in the Federal Register, which does not meet the requirements for formal rulemaking requirements. Why should we care about retrievability? Again, the NRC knowingly violated its own regulations. Federal law requires that nuclear waste storage system be designed to, read it before. Ready retrieval means you can easily get to the spent fuel, not the canisters, and move, inspect, and repair if necessary. That's the federal requirement. Retrievability, not cask relocation. Non-compliance is not an option, but forcing the NRC may take action and require legal formal challenge, which certainly we don't have the resources to do such. Retrievability is required because of the following. Without this capability, we can never inspect, repair, or transfer the fuel to any long-term facility, and it is a federal law, both in the Energy Reorganization Act, approved by Congress, and 10 CFR. It may be necessary for the eventual transportation from the present location. It is necessary for fuel inspection and repair. As Charles pointed out, these things are all degrading and they cannot be inspected or repaired. Without the retrievability, the risk to the public and the future generations is significantly increased. They're required for long-term geological disposal. Unless we have the capability to retrieve the fuel, we can't have geological disposal. And required for possible reprocessing, something I don't think is ever going to be considered. Slide 5, federal regulations prohibit the NRC from changing or reinterpreting the regulations in 10 CFR 72 that I am aware of. This was done by the issuance of a new device called an Industry Staff Guidance, or ISG 1, 2, and 3, thus totally changing the intent of the regulation on retrievability. Next slide. This is a photo of the equipment required to move a canister at San Onofre. As you can see in this picture, there's not a trivial job. It takes extreme effort, time, equipment, personnel, and significant radiological exposure to workers to actually remove one of these canisters from its current locations. So in the event of an emergency like a giant storm, there's essentially no way for these things to be moved in a timely fashion. With the encased salts and debris, the canister may not be able to be removed from the vertical ventilation module. If you've got to take a salt at the bottom, it's certainly going to increase the friction between the canister and the VVM. Now, Holtec has produced a final safety analysis report where it discusses procedures for unloading the high storm UMAC system in the spent fuel pool. When I saw this, it sounded very interesting, but then I read it. Apparently, Edison has no concerns. The spent fuel pools are planned to be demolished shortly. This conscious decision was approved by the California Coastal Commission, apparently with no knowledge and total disregard of federal requirements, but will it significantly reduce decommissioning expenses. This is the most egregious example of Holtec, a subcontractor to Edison, lying to the NRC and the public by stating, quote, if the MPC cavity cannot be successfully returned to a safe analyzed condition, the fuel must be placed in a safe condition in the spent fuel pool. They don't mention there is none. The completion time is reasonable based on the time to reflood the MPC. 24 hours, no, it's not. Cut the MPC wells, which can only be done in a pool. Move the transfer cast into the spent fuel pool, remove the MPC lid, and remove the spent fuel assemblies in an orderly manner without challenging personnel. These are the only legally binding words, and they talk about the spent fuel and the pool, which is not going to be there. Next slide. The High Storm 100 system, which is almost identical to the UMAC system. Unloading procedures describe the general actions necessary to prepare the MPC for unloading. Special precautions are outlined to ensure personnel safety during the unloading operations and prevent the rest of the MPC overpressurization and thermal shock to the storage of the spent fuel assemblies. Nobody knows what happens when you take 800-degree canisters and put them into cold water if it were available. There are no provisions discussed to prevent thermal shock when the canister is submerged in cold water, and the consequences are unknown. The High Storm 100 system canister is almost identical to the UMAC system employed at San Onofre. The NRC must take some type of enforcement action for these false statements by Southern California Edison's contractor Holtec, but they won't. Slide 9. This part of the FSAR clearly requires all cooling in canisters must be restored within 24 hours or damage will occur. That's a pretty bold statement, and that's right in their legally binding tech specs. More than 24 hours damage is going to occur. We know that in flooding, they can't do it. We know this to be impossible, and there will likely be a major release of radioactivity into the environment that may persist for years, such as Fukushima and Chernobyl. Next slide. This is the cover page from the 671-page UMAX FSAR. The document has to be totally revised to address compliance with potential flooding issues, criticality, and retrievability, and also emergency planning. Should this analysis conclude an unacceptable risk to the public, then Edison must consider installing a hot cell and constructing a hardened structure with thick walled cast, as shown in the upcoming slides, thus demonstrating regulatory compliance to meet the federal requirements for flooding, retrievability, and criticality. We must, next slide, please. We must demand that Edison retain the spent fuel pools until a suitable hardened structure is constructed as shown in this particular photo. Where do we go from here? Summarize, we must have the licensee of the NRC provide an accurate analysis for flooding, retrievability, and criticality. Provide a hardened for seismic and tsunami resistance structure with thick wall cast for flood and tsunami protection, and a terrorist deterrent meeting federal siting requirements. We must continue our attempts to reestablish a dialogue with the NRC chairman, the commissioners, the Office of Public Affairs, the NRC staff, and the NRC's Inspector General. Reiterate our numerous requests with the NRC technical staff for a public meeting per commission policy. We must update the final safety analysis report demonstrating compliance with all federal regulations. Based on the evaluation, we need to evaluate emergency planning based on realistic accident dose rate. We will attempt to work to accelerate the NRC and Inspector General investigation, and we must retain the spent fuel or a hot cell demonstrating regulatory compliance for the short term. Why does the NRC refuse to enforce its regulation? The answer is quite simple, that no nuclear power plants, commercial would be economical if the regulations were enforced. Next slide, please. Let your feelings be known by your elected officials, letters to the news media, and to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I have provided some titles here. Please do it. It'll make a difference. Concluding remarks of significant. NRC may also be present tonight here for this presentation, but we will not be putting them on the spot, asking them any questions at this time. That is not the purpose of our meeting. However, we will provide the opportunity to the NRC and Edison should they decide to make a brief statement tonight. From my perspective, living 2,500 miles away from San Onofre, my family and I are safe from this impending disaster. I may have a different opinion if I were residing in Southern California. I say this after sleeping on a nuclear submarine for months on end, 100 feet from a safe nuclear power reactor. A special thanks to Doug Wood for his audio-visual expertise. We would not have been able to produce this presentation without his assistance. And very importantly, we look forward to working toward a future resolution of these significant safety issues and reiterate our invitation to the NRC, Edison, and the community engagement panel for a productive professional meetings in the near future. So these are a few of the tasks we're facing right now at San Onofre. Thank you for your attention. And I will be here to respond to questions, but now I'm going to turn it back to Charles.
Thank you, Paul Blanche. Our next speaker is Gary Hedrick of San Clemente Green. But before I introduce him, I'd like to share with you a portion of quite a lengthy letter that we received from Rear Admiral Leonard Herring yesterday in support of this actual meeting. And there's a message, and it goes like this. Dear concerned citizens of San Diego, I'm writing this memorandum in support of the efforts of those presenting today and their respective organizations. By way of introduction, I am a retired Rear Admiral, Len Herring, former commander, Navy Region Southwest, and current co-chair of Congressman Levin's Songs Task Force. Over the course of the last 2 years, I've been deeply involved in the efforts by which this meeting today is unfortunately being convened. While not an expert in the field of nuclear engineering, I am very experienced in regulatory behavior, regulatory administration, proper investigation procedures, and documenting of findings, proper training techniques, and certification requirements utilized by the Navy to handle nuclear weapons and hazardous materials and leaderships. Exploring issues concerning songs during these last 2 years has been challenging. I'm going to skip to the last 2 paragraphs here. This is quite a long letter, but if you'd like to read it, and I encourage you to do so, we're going to publish it very shortly at grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre. That's grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Gary Hedrick. Gary Hedrick is a public citizen in the tradition of Socrates. In 2007, Gary and his wife, Lori, formed San Clemente Green to promote a sustainable future for their community. By 2010, their work with the city resulted in a sustainability action plan that guides programs and policies to this day. San Clemente Green led the grassroots effort to shut down the San Onofre nuclear generating station starting in 2010, when whistleblowers accurately predicted the demise of the nuclear power plant. And that happened in 2012. Are you ready, Gary?
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you. What a panel we have, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of it. I'll go on with my presentation here. And I think I'll follow up where Kathy left off with such powerful statements about the most important lessons that we can learn from her experience. And it's that the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, which is far from over, was entirely preventable. It's just another example of decision makers ignoring experts because they're telling them something they don't want to hear. I remember watching this story unfold and witnessing the complete failure of the most well-prepared nuclear energy country in the world. Seismologists that were predicting a massive 9.0 earthquake and tsunami had been dismissed and ignored. That sound familiar? Edison must heed this lesson and respect the unpredictable power of nature. Well, there's no question that we live in a tsunami zone with reminders like this all around. Edison's own documents show that they're in a tsunami zone, but how can it be so easily dismissed as a threat that is not credible? This is the tsunami wall that we're relying on to keep us safe. Take a close look at the wall on the right. See how it's holding up to this harsh, salty environment. Metal and concrete do not do well so close to the ocean as we see in this dilapidated wall. We can expect the same is true for the thin canisters that were only meant for short-term storage just beyond this wall. In a moment, you'll see the scene on the left come to life in a very brief video. Few people have had the opportunity to see the tsunami wall from such close proximity. You get wet if you're not careful. I guess I should have been more careful. Edison has a different way of representing the tsunami wall. Look how they use an extremely low camera angle at very low tide and see the tiny person way in the distance to make the wall seem larger. Knowing what you know now, doesn't it seem to call into question their own credibility? You would expect them to be more concerned about how much wall is left above high tide when they tell us how much protection it provides. San Onofre, which was by far the most unsafe nuclear power plant in the country, was doing like Japan did by ignoring what they didn't want to hear. The new steam generator project was behind schedule and well over budget, so managers retaliated against their own engineers who were saying that more testing was needed before new steam generators were put into service. Whistleblowers came to us because we were the only environmental organization listening to them, and we agreed to keep their identities protected. Employees finally gave us what the news media was clamoring for: hard evidence and internal documents, hoping to buy time for more testing. This particular document was about the results from a questionable confidential survey showing 25% of the workforce feared retaliation for bringing up safety concerns, but it still wasn't enough to stall the restart. On January 31st, 2012, less than 2 years later, our worst fears were realized. Fortunately, the engineers were quick to do an emergency shutdown when just a few of the many thousands of tubes started to leak radiation into the air we breathe. Extremely violent vibrations resulted from a computer error in the design of the new steam generators, which underestimated the vibration potential by 400%. It became obvious that Edison had not learned a lesson because their proposal was to run the other twin generator for 5 months at 70% to see what would happen. Warnings from nuclear operators went unheeded, and it looked like Edison would get their way once again. But we had a surprise for them. We had flown Naoto Kan, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time of the accident, to San Diego for an emergency meeting and press conference. He was flanked by 2 former NRC commissioners who oversaw the accidents at 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. They all advised against restarting the defective reactor, but would it be enough to change Edison's mind? Well, you can imagine the huge relief we felt on the morning of June 7th, 2013, when Edison threw in the towel, only 3 days after the meeting with Naoto Kan. It was big news around the globe, dashing ambitions of the nuclear industry. As you've already heard, nothing has changed. We're being told that floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, and terrorist attacks are nothing to be concerned about because they're simply not credible until they are, and then it'll be too late. Edison has left us with no way out if something doesn't go exactly as planned, which always seems to be the case. Simply put, we need a dry transfer system, also known as a hot cell, and an extremely robust bunker to protect nuclear waste from these very real threats. Without these structures in place, it's only a matter of time before thin canisters begin to fail with no way to stop it from getting completely out of control. Fortunately for us, our local congressman, Mike Levin, has aggressively sought answers to the elusive goals of getting the nuclear waste at San Onofre moved to a safer location. Here's an insightful clip from a recent interview I did with him.
When I started, I sat down, and you may have been there, I forget. I was with a group very early, and we went to go and meet with Edison, and we were there with Pedro Pizarro, who's the president of Edison International, president of the parent company. And I like and respect Pedro. He's a very smart guy. But I told him, you know, I don't represent the interests of the utility in Congress. I represent the interests of my constituents. And I think that's the clear difference. I'm not just going to do his bit. I'm not just going to listen to what Edison's perspective is without getting the informed perspective from constituents. And so that's why the task force started. I just think inherently having a group that was started by the utility, it's kind of hard to have a objective perspective on things. So I think we've been very successful, and I'm grateful to you, Gary, and I'm grateful to everybody that's participated on the task force over the last 3+ years. And, you know, we're really just getting started. It's going to take time.
Well, thank goodness for people like Congressman Levin, and also for Admiral Herring, who is co-chair of the task force. He was responsible for all things on his ship that were nuclear. He is another outstanding voice of reason with the experience and credentials to back it up. Here are some short video clips I put together from a virtual press conference with Admiral Herring and Congressman Levin about the task force findings. I want you to hear the warnings from both in their own words.
Even some of the casks that have been utilized over the years are nearing or have passed their life expectancy. If you look through the report, you'll see the storage protocols that are now being utilized seem to be very dysfunctional and almost driven by industry as opposed to the regulatory safety requirements that provide us the opportunity for both the safe handling, the storage, and long-term commitment for its monitoring. Once it's stored, it's not like you know, a garbage pile. It'll decrete by itself. It takes hundreds of thousands of years for this material to no longer be a hazard to our environment. And we need to monitor how that works. And I think that this report, again, clearly shows how the relaxations over the course of time have put us at risk. And I hope that this is a piece of the report that really comes out and causes people concern as to where we're going.
Considering federal legislation that requires spent nuclear fuel canisters to have a design life of at least 100 years. Failure risks of canisters due to stress, corrosion, cracking must not be overlooked. And I'm grateful to our members of the task force that highlighted the issues specifically with the Holtec canisters being used at SOMS. the work of the task force really solidified for me the importance of not being satisfied with the current Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Department of Energy structure. And the canister issue is one that was reinforced. Again, not something that we haven't heard, but specific legislation at the federal level mandating a 100-year life for the design of nuclear fuel canisters. And then making sure that we're doing everything possible with regard to inspection. You see what they're doing in other parts of the world. Switzerland immediately comes to mind at some of their hardened and enclosed buildings and their use of the thicker cast as opposed to thin wall canisters. We must do better. We need to prioritize the safety and health and well-being of our community, not the profits of the nuclear industry.
Even some of
If you read that slide, there's some important information there, and time is not on our side. The only route for nuclear waste is under threat from sea level rise. Who knows what condition those tracks will be in when we're actually ready to move the nuclear waste to a safer location. We need a different kind of tsunami, a human wave of unrelenting pressure to insist on more transparency, public awareness, and good science to find the best way forward. Edison should understand from past experience that we are here for the long haul, and we will continue to raise our concerns until they meet our reasonable expectations. From my own personal experience, thinking that we can't get a hot cell and a robust bunker built is what I'd call not credible. It's the only sensible next step for us to take. We shouldn't have to work so hard at making safety come first, but that's just the way it is. We've proven that we can overcome what are seemingly insurmountable odds. Our success in preventing an experimental restart of a defective nuclear reactor happened when we least expected it. It will likely be the same again with getting a hot cell and bunker system installed at San Onofre. We can get this done if we support the efforts of dedicated groups and individuals like the ones presenting tonight by staying informed and answering calls to action when needed. Together, we can protect our beautiful, pristine coastline for all of California and beyond. Like so many problems the world faces today, truth, commitment, and cooperation must prevail, with the priority always being for the greater good of the people and our one and only planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. I love that idea of a human tsunami. Before we get into questions and comments and answers, I'd like to finish reading the last part of Admiral Herring's letter. It goes like this. I have discussed most of these issues with the NRC's Inspector General's office, but to date, I've heard or seen nothing of consequence. Regulations are, in my business, written to be followed and not waived. Our investigation and experience over the course of the last 2 years have shown that this is not the way our nuclear industry operates. If you cannot comply, ask for a waiver, and it will probably be granted. And chances are there is no compliance requirement date set for them to attain full compliance. I believe the most important issue, and the reason this gathering became so important, is that when many of the issues were brought to the Community Engagement Panel, an organization established to address citizens' concerns, they were in a similar fashion dismissed, or the message provided to the concerned citizens echoed the message of the Utilities Public Affairs Department, or were dismissed as already addressed. I'm sorry this has become such a concern, but the truth is the system is broken and those involved have a lot to answer for. Take the time today to listen and ask yourself if these questions had been properly addressed and our concerns satisfied, would any of this be necessary? Respectfully, Admiral Leonard Herring. Okay, we have an enormous number of questions and some terrific comments. Would our panelists unmute their microphones? And if you've got a camera, you might want to turn it on. And I'm just going to go from the top of these questions. The first question is, in the past, this is from Catherine, have you considered nuclear energy to be a safe source of energy? Should it be considered as an alternative to the use of fossil fuel to reduce climate change? I think you're going to get many different answers on that one, Catherine. So I'd like to start with Kathy Iwani. Is nuclear energy a safe source of energy?
Well, in my opinion, I experienced the most unsafe of the nuclear bad playbook play out in real time. And it's interesting, you know, I did see another question that relates exactly to this question. And I'd like to bring up a very interesting professor at USC, Dr. Najmedi Meshkati. And he was actually, he's written extensively. So his last name is Meshkati, Meshkati. He's written extensively on safety culture and how oftentimes systems of people, safety regulations, safety culture of the workers at a certain plant can be thoroughly engaged, thoroughly followed with a really good teamwork. Now, I did see another question in the questions today, and it was it alluded to the fact that, believe it or not, up the northeast coast from the Fukushima plant, there were in effect larger tsunami waves. And yet I don't remember the name of this plant, but it was the plant escaped unscathed. They were able to shut down all systems. They were able to see what was coming, and they got through the earthquake and the tsunami unscathed. So to me, Dr. Najmedi Meshkati has been to Japan. He's been a consultant after the Fukushima tragedy. And I think it just getting back to whether nuclear is a good energy or not, it's as long as we have human error, and that's what causes nuclear issues to go critical. There are not enough safety mechanisms in place. In my opinion, it's not the best way to go. But you're asking the wrong person, I think. Paul.
Okay, our next question is from Dwight.
Now, Charles, I would like to just add to Kathy's response.
Briefly, please.
Having seen safe nuclear power plants and unsafe nuclear power plants, and recognizing we live in a capitalistic economy, the Navy plants are safe. There's no, in my mind, and safety is just a perception anyway. And I transitioned from the Navy to the commercial and just could not believe the difference in everything with respect to safety. The commercial plants can be made safe. The problem is, if they ever made them safe, like the Navy nuclear power plants, the cost of construction and design would not be competitive with any other form of energy. That is the main reason we don't have safe nuclear power plants. The Navy has no real concern about budget. Their concern is reliability and safety. The concern of the commercial plants is simply dollars, and they will do anything to increase that bottom line. Thank you.
I'd like to add just one quick comment if I could. I know it's short on time, but until we have a solution for nuclear waste, we shouldn't even be talking about using more nuclear power. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a great question. Please describe what a hot cell facility is and if it would be helpful at songs.
You want me to try that, or?
How about you, Paul?
Yeah, a hot cell facility has been used at various reprocessing facilities throughout the world. They are very expensive. I would estimate they're in the range of $1 billion, but they've got to be capable of dealing with that 6-foot diameter, 24-foot high cast. It's never been done. I'm not sure how a hot cell facility could be constructed for a reasonable cost. It's probably going to approach $1 billion, and it's a research project, and it's going to take a long time to do it. It can be done on a small scale, but doing it on a large scale is extremely difficult. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of research and development.
Great, thank you. I have two questions now for Gary. This is from Ray. It says, according to the newspaper Coast News, the protective seawall at San Onofre is 28 feet versus the 14-foot wall shown in your slide. Can you comment on that? And then we've got a second question from Jerry that says, with the failure of Yucca Mountain, do the panelists feel there is any possibility of the US approving a safe, high-level nuclear waste depository similar to that of the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant in Finland?
Well, you want me to take that on?
I do.
I wanted to just briefly touch on what Paul said too. There's examples of hot cells in other parts of the world that are functioning well, and we could copy and even improve on what they've done, like this Willag facility in Switzerland. But so I've lost track of the question you asked originally. Help me out there, Charles.
Sure. With the failure of Yucca Mountain, do you feel there's any possibility of the US approving a safe, high-level nuclear waste depository similar to the one in Finland? And that was addressed to the whole panel, as well as you.
Well, I'll just quickly say that Finland's doing the first deep geological project, and it's about to get started. And even that is an unproven situation. So if we can take the first steps, we can worry about the rest later. But the first step is to repackage the canisters into thick casks and keep them in bunkers above ground. And we'll refine the process for a permanent solution. But right now, we've got to get to that step before these thin canisters start to fail.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add to that a little bit, Charles. And you know, we've seen everyone, you know, Department of Energy is funding a study, going around looking for volunteers to take all this junk. You know, it's nice and thought, and it was done in Finland. And there are people in the political environment that's very different in Finland than it is here. There's not the same fear in Finland of nuclear that we have here in the United States. And you may see communities that are willing to take the waste. And it's what I call the donut hole effect. Those communities in the immediate area will say yes, just like they did at Yucca Mountain. But outside that donut hole, the rest of the donut says, I don't want this in my state. And that's exactly what happened, because right inside that hole, there's a lot of money and a lot of work, and they support it. But the people in the surrounding areas, I just am not optimistic at all they're ever going to find anyone to agree for a high-level waste disposal site in the United States.
I'd like to say too that I think part of the reason that this discussion in a way has been refused to have been made by the NRC in a public realm, and also by Southern California CEP, Southern California Edison CEP, is that there are solutions happening in other countries and they're very, very expensive. Now, when we talk about a permanent repository, that is a solution that has not been found anywhere in the world to be 100% foolproof, effective, going to happen, airtight. It's a sure thing. The one thing we do know that's happening in other countries is that they have enclosed hardened bunkers with thick-walled casks that have escaped the ravages of Fukushima. It's happening in Switzerland, it's happening in Japan, and it's also happening in Germany. So it's time to stop kicking the can, pun intended, down the road and secure the waste on site to the best of our very, very wealthy country's ability. If other countries can do it, it's time to talk about doing it in our country. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Sarah. And it says, can you make the Gerald Kuhn article titled Paleoseismic Features available to everyone? And I'd like to answer yes. We'll make sure that that's on the website at grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre, and hopefully we can get that up for you tomorrow. There's a comment from Catherine Johnson and kind of an open-ended question. It says, it seems as if you're only talking about San Onofre. What about other nuclear facilities such as Diablo Canyon in Northern California? Is it also a danger as it is being considered for reactivation? Since Japan has only 30% of their energy provided by hydroelectric, what is your recommendation for Japan, fossil fuel or nuclear? I'd like to answer part of that, and I think it's sort of beyond the capacity of this group to make energy recommendations for Japan. But Paul, maybe you could address what it is about the other facilities such as Diablo Canyon. And do you think there's a danger in reactivation, or should they proceed with shutting it down?
Well, I'm not in favor of continued, not with the present regulatory environment and failure to enforce regulations. I certainly would not endorse restart of or continued operation of Diablo Canyon for a number of reasons. Let's talk about the waste first. Now, at Diablo Canyon, I've seen pictures. I don't think there's a problem of a tsunami impacting the nuclear waste there because it's at a quite high elevation. But the problem is with San Onofre continuing to produce more waste every day, we're just going to add to that burden for future generations, and we have no solution, and we won't have a solution for a long time. We don't even have the ability to transport this at this time. So I would not support the continued generation of nuclear waste until we have a solution as to what we can do with it.
Okay, now here's another question for you, Paul. At what canister temperature will the canisters buckle? Will the middle buckle outward or inward at the middle? At what temperature would it rupture, and what would happen if it ruptures?
Okay, all I can say is, first of all, I'm not a metallurgist, and whether it would buckle in the middle or not. As far as rupture goes, we don't have the data. It's never been tested. You know, again, the NRC has stated in writing it's not credible. Certainly, it's going to rupture if you ever get a criticality. I would suspect that we're going to have leakage due to the thermal shock. Now, everyone says, what's the motive force for forcing that is out the radioactive material out? Well, if you remember, the outside of the cask, if you have a rupture, is going to be probably 800 degrees, and water comes in, hits that, it's going to flash the steam. not only on the outside of the canister, but on the inside of the canister. There is your motive force for dispersing this radioactive material out to some unknown area. Another thing that needs to be addressed in the analysis.
That's great. Here's a question for Kathy from James Heddle. I believe there is another nuclear plant along Japan's coast that experienced an even higher tsunami wave than Daiichi, but was able to safely shut down because they heeded the warnings. If you know this to be true, what lessons can we draw from this? And I guess it's Mary Beth.
Yeah.
Brandon.
That was the one that I was just referring to, and I'm sorry. Yes, it was Mary Beth's question. What I believe, and I've learned from Dr. Meshkati, his first name is Najmedi Meshkati. He's an engineer, and he's also a graduate school professor of nuclear matters at USC. And I've spoken to him at length on the phone, and he's written he's published several articles on safety culture. And he was also a consultant to the, everyone says that Japan had a regulator. It was kind of like nuclear industry regulation. It was literally after the Fukushima accident that they decided to get a regulator going. And so Dr. Mishkati was part of setting that up. He was a consultant going to and from LA to Fukushima and to, Tokyo to set that up with the government. But what his publications allude to is the fact that that plant, and someone probably on this very call, Paul, do you know the name of the plant it's up the coast?
Not off the top of my head, no.
And I had it in my notes, but it's up the coast northeast from Fukushima. They escaped. Their actual tsunami waves were much bigger due to the geographical coastline, all sorts of underwater formations, etc. And why is it that they escaped unscathed from the same tragedy? Well, that goes back to safety culture, and they had everything followed. There was no sleeping at the wheel. There was no human error. And so in answer to Mary Beth's question, yes, I do know that to be true. And I wish that there was more light shown on that. But you all that are remaining on this call, God bless you all. Please refer to Dr. Mishkati at USC. He's written on safety culture, and we are clearly lacking that at San Onofre. Human error is the reason we need safety culture. Thank you.
Here's a question from Beth Leeds, a very prominent activist. And she says, at the last meeting with NRC several years ago, Scott Morris promised another meeting. Scott Morris is one of the top executives at the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Because of the information presented today, she asks, I am calling for an emergency meeting in San Juan within 2 weeks. So I guess that's San Onofre. So I'll tell you what, Ms. Leeds, I will personally write a letter to Scott Morris requesting that, and I'll copy it to you. So you'll also have his email address. The next question is for Kathy and Paul from Nancy Wolf. It says, super impressed with this presentation. Did you get any sense of specific steps that must be taken to support San Onofre through climate storms and other issues like earthquakes? What rights do we have to force the issue?
Well, as far as rights to force the issue, that it's very difficult to, and we have taken through the state of New York litigation against the NRC, and even $30 million that we spent, we still didn't win. They protect themselves. The judges are appointed by the NRC. Litigation is extremely difficult. The only thing we can do is hope and pray that the people, that we can get a public outcry that we will not tolerate the danger and the irresponsible lack of regulation enforcement. And we need to do something. A legal challenge is we just don't have the funds to do that, and I'm not sure the worthwhileness of such an effort, but it's public pressure. That's the only thing that will ever get these people to change. And, you know, I looked at the attendance list, and there are some high level NRC people listening in, but we'll make sure that a copy of this gets to the appropriate people in the NRC and the Inspector General's office and the chairman, and hopefully your congressmen and so on and so forth out there. But we need a public outcry. It deserves it. When you put people in danger, and we don't know what that probability is, except I wouldn't feel comfortable with having my grandchildren out there. We need a public outcry. We need people to write letters to the editor, whatever you have to do, saying, hey, government, you need to do something.
I'd like to add to that, and perhaps after I give my idea on what we can do to force change, Paul might want in his own way to describe, you know, in what ways have you engaged with the NRC? But before you talk about that, I'd like to sort of, in the way of forcing change, it takes, change is never going to come from the people making the decisions based on cost analysis. It's going to come from what's necessary, and it's going to come from grassroots. So with that in mind, you'll hear shortly probably from Paul, but in January of 2020, Paul and public watchdogs went ahead to the NRC, and they had a 2.206 petition process. Well, I've been following this. I became a big fan of Paul, and I became a big fan of what public watchdogs had set out to do. And what I decided to do was take the concerns that Paul has shared tonight, and I knew, because there are elected individuals that are sitting on the board of the community engagement panel at Southern Cal Edison, and I said, hey, why don't we have tonight's conversation? You know, let's reinvigorate that kind of meeting, because literally no one was showing up. Why don't we have Paul present to the CEP? And knowing that the community engagement panel had a fabulous charter, that charter purports to commit to public dialogue and commit to the community's input on decommissioning concerns at San Onofre. So what we did is I requested last December, it was a heavily endorsed letter. There are some of the people that endorsed this letter. We had city council members of local city councils, we had mayors, we had documentarians, we had scientists, and we had community leaders and researchers. And they heavily endorsed my request to Southern Cal Edison, hey, let's have an open conversation about this. Well, lo and behold, the CEP came back to me and they said, sorry, we can't do that. And they essentially parroted the NRC speaking points, saying that, hey, your concerns are not valid. We've already addressed this, and essentially what you're worried about is not credible. However, in actuality, what really was happening was that there was no proof, no studies, no risk assessment, or any assurance that the equipment was on site and the training of workers was to such a level that they could avert a crisis or a catastrophe at San Onofre in the case of a flood or a tsunami. So here we are, you know, having this conversation, and this is exactly what, getting back to that fabulous question, how do you force change? It's about getting experts together, the technical, the political, the economics, all of it together, to put that puzzle together and have these uncomfortable, very cost-informing conversations. Paul, perhaps you'd like to speak about your history
Really
with the
like
NRC.
that. You just alluded to what has been our contact and what our efforts been, and I always document what I say, and I just briefly want to say that we have filed 2 formal petitions per CFR. They were not even accepted, and basically they said, and one of them was on flooding. We've already addressed this issue, so we're not going to continue. We're not going to consider your petition. But then I elevated it along with Charles to I'd also had some input from one of the commissioner's offices who, why don't you ask for a public meeting as per the commission policy? So I took that commission policy, went to the top guy in the NRC staff, the executive director for operations, Dan Dorman, and I requested a public meeting for their policy. And he essentially gave me the middle finger and said no. So I then elevated it to the commission, the chairman of the commission appointed by the president, and asked the commission to directly technical staff to conduct a public meeting as provided for in our policy. And the chairman wrote back to me and said, hey, how about a private meeting? So we had a private meeting on May 17th last year. Kathy, you were in attendance, Admiral Herring and Charles was in attendance. And we had a very cordial meeting with the chairman, and Kathy documented it very well. And it clearly stated that we request you direct the staff to have a public meeting. No response from the chairman. 3 months later, I said, where's your response? Still no response. The NRC does not want to communicate with me, but I've had a little bit, I've got my foot in the door in another way, and there's still a little hope. But we've got the Inspector General who does not directly report to the commission. He reports to Congress. We've also had a Zoom conversation with another presidential appointee. So we've made every conceivable effort to sit down and talk, just like Biden and McCarthy are now talking. We need to talk. You can't do it through letters and throw stones at one another. We don't want to do that. We want to have a civil conversation based on technical and regulatory issues.
Thank you. Here's a comment from, I hope I'm saying this right, Mikkel Lee. It says, a note should be made about the absurdity of mitigating an event at songs caused by a catastrophic earthquake or tsunami. Most of the infrastructure, roads, electric power, and communications would be badly damaged. Unlike Fukushima and Chernobyl, songs is in a highly demographically concentrated region. I see you nodding to that, Kathy. Do you want to comment?
Well, I'd just like to say that in Fukushima, you had 300,000 people evacuate. And let me tell you, it's God's country up there. It is country, it's provincial. There's no one that lives there. And thank God, half of that radioactivity went out to sea. What we're talking about at San Onofre, within a 50-mile radius, is over I think it's 8.5 million people. And I'll be the first to say, I moved here 12 years ago, and Highway 5 is not what it was 12 years ago. 12 years ago, yeah, maybe you had terrible traffic jams, but this is turning into LA Light here. And it's one of the, I think it's the 3rd largest economic trade corridors in the United States, coming in and out of the what is it? I don't want to say harbor, but the trade area of Long Beach. And so if we're looking at not only treasure, human lives, environment, you are looking at a large swath of agriculture, industry. The white paper on this, something like $13 trillion would be affected economically. And if you can look at those numbers, that's what people look at. They don't, apparently our regulators and Coastal Commission, et cetera, they're not looking at the failed reef as a result of the radionuclides being dumped into the ocean since 1969. I don't want to get into that now. That's for another webinar. However, when it comes down to economics, we need to look at this. People have homes, they have businesses. This is a highly, in Michelle's astute comment, highly concentrated population.
I'd like to add a little bit, the identified person is Michelle Lee, who resides in the Indian Point area in New York, and both Kathy and I know her and respect her very much. But if you look at Fukushima and the evacuation does not make people safe. A lot of people were killed or died as a result of the evacuation in a relatively low population zone. We have people in nursing homes. We have sick people that cannot be evacuated. I saw numbers of 1,500 people died because of the evacuation. We got to look at that very carefully. Evacuation, by the way, in San Onofre is impossible. It cannot help or happen. So thank you, Michelle, for your comments, and we'll be talking.
Okay, here's a couple comments. This one's from Mike Epineder. Thank you all for your support. If not for your efforts, we would be toast, ... And this is from Liz Shear and David Jewell. And it says, this is terrific. Thank you, heroines and heroes. And we have a question, a lot of questions along this line. And Gary, maybe you could take a shot at answering this. People are asking, do we need to reopen the conversation about Yucca Mountain? What happened to Yucca Mountain, and why can't we put stuff in Yucca Mountain?
Well, Yucca Mountain is an interesting story. It's kind of a good example of what fails, and that's why we're going for a consent-based siting if we do find a place to have a permanent solution. But besides the politics and geology being such a struggle, the fact is now we've created so much more waste that even if Yucca Mountain performed as expected, we'd still have to build another one. We don't have enough space for all the nuclear waste, especially what we continue to produce.
Okay, here's a comment from Beth that says, quotes Einstein saying it's the worst way to heat water. And a question from Danny Brown. What can we do to push Edison to make a chance and move faster? Is there a specific person? What is step one to get things moving in this process? Wow, that's a really great question. And there's no easy answer.
Well, I'll throw something in there just because it's already in progress. We're working hard to develop a strategy paper, and by we, there's some people not involved in this particular event, but a lot of progress being made, and not focusing so much on what's wrong with the nuclear systems that are in contention, but what are we proposing to do? What do we think is a reasonable solution so that we can all get behind it, have workshops, talk about the real facts of the matter, and come up with something that is universally acceptable as much as possible. But until we get a consensus of some kind, our messaging is just going to be all over the place. So I'm excited about what's just around the corner, and it's the beginning of a discussion that will hopefully give us the results that we want, a reasonable solution to this just unacceptable situation.
That's great.
I would like to just make a brief comment on some numbers about what Gary said. Yucca Mountain was initially conceived based on 77,000 tons of nuclear waste. We already have over 110,000 tons of nuclear waste. So what Gary said was 100%. Even if we got Yucca Mountain and everything there today, we wouldn't end the problem. We need another waste site. So the problem is huge, and certainly I do not have a solution, but we need to discuss potential solutions, realistic solutions, and it's going to be very, very difficult.
Okay, and Danny's asking, what can we do to move faster? And is there a specific person we can target? What is step one to get things moving in this process? I'd like to respond. Public Watchdogs has exhausted almost every legal remedy available for forcing Edison to move the nuclear waste. We fought a case all the way to the Supreme Court. It was rejected. We took it to the highest court in California. They declined to rule in our favor or hear it. And Paul Blanche and Public Watchdogs have filed multiple petitions to revoke before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is literally a request to revoke Edison's permit and privilege to bury nuclear waste on the beach. So Danny's asking, is there a specific step we can do to get things moving? Does anyone have a simple answer for this?
Let me just try that. I think the first step is with the NRC, and a colleague of more than 30 years has now been put into a position reporting directly to the commission. And she and I had a conversation last Friday evening, and at least I got my foot in the door, and I'm hoping that we can pursue that route through the professional relationship this person and I have with one another, and she reports right to the commission. So I'm going to work on pursuing that. Cautiously optimistic, but at least we've got our foot in the door and we can give it a try.
Okay. Here's a comment from Kathy Moore. So maybe the only solution is to have the government be the only one to own and operate these plants as nonprofits, in parens, provided the waste can be dealt with responsibly and permanently, of course. Take it out of the free market system. I can comment on that if no one else wants to.
I can too.
Okay, well, you know, the nuclear waste is the property of the nuclear power plant until the United States government accepts it. And the problem is there's no way the United States government can accept this nuclear waste because no one's been able to figure out where to put it. Nobody wants this stuff. So it's basically a stalemate. As far as operating these nuclear power plants as nonprofits, the one thing that we know can get a company like Edison motivated is a profit motive. And, you know, getting them to spend money from the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund is a great way for them to actually make money creating improvements. So there's an opportunity there, but I don't think it's possible to operate this as a nonprofit because it would just be giving Edison a free pass for having created a horrific problem.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I know I'm making too many comments, but if we look at government taking over responsibility for nuclear waste, just look around at Rocky Flats, Hanford, Savannah River, West Valley. Every nuclear site operated by the government has turned into an absolute disaster. I would rather trust Southern Cal Edison before I trust the Department of Energy or any other government agency to handle and be responsible for our nuclear waste.
Okay. Here's a comment and I think a question from Ace Hoffman. Please note that the Navy's used reactors are extremely hazardous, much more so than commercial spent fuel. And America has over 130 used nuclear Navy reactors already, with another 80 still in submarines. There's no solution to the Navy waste either. And then he also said later on, correction, 132 from submarines, plus reactors from 9 cruisers, 2 each and 1 carrier, 8 cores. What do you think, Paul? You're a former Navy guy.
Yeah, I know. A lot of this is classified information, but what I do know, and I've actually participated in the refueling of 2 Navy nuclear reactors, and you got to recognize these cores are not much bigger than a 55-gallon drum. And the Navy has, the ability to operate under classified security and all kinds of cover. So what we did, both in Hartford here with a reactor and also down in New London, is they would take the whole reactor out, and essentially put it in a water-cooled cask, and they would put it on a truck and not tell anyone where it's going, and they would ship it out to Idaho Falls, Idaho. Details of what they're doing out there, I would assume they're sitting in spent fuel pools for cooling, but we can't get a lot of information. But they have the ability to transport this stuff cross country, and they've done it. My old reactors are out there from the Patrick Henry and the Stonewall Jackson, and they do it under government security, and we never know whether that truck that goes by our front door is carrying nuclear, high-level nuclear waste. And by the way, the nuclear waste from the Navy is a whole lot more radioactive than what we've seen. Physically, much smaller. So, we would take probably, 70 some trucks from San Onofre, where the Navy could take a whole submarine reactor and ship it on one rail car or one truck without ever telling anyone. So that's the way the government does it. And they've done it safely.
Here's one from Bart Ziegler that I'd like to answer, and anyone else can join in. It says, is the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, captured by the industry, as was the Federal Aviation Administration when the Boeing 737s were having problems? Bart, I think the only answer to that is yes, it is a captured regulatory agency, and it's far worse than the FAA. In my perception is that essentially the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gets its marching orders from the industry, and that it's controlled by the industry that it's supposed to regulate, and it's a real problem. Does anyone else want to say anything about this?
I just like to say that we're at 736, first of all, but in addition to the fact that the NRC is funded to the tune of, what I've seen, 89% of all licensees. That means nuclear power plants are funding the NRC. Now, how do you have a regulator that is supposed to regulate when its paycheck depends on who they're regulating? So that would be perhaps something for this group to think about, to increase the awareness of how to enforce action. I personally think that when we get experts together, and we get the right experts together, bringing youth, energized, engaged youth into this movement,
I object.
there's nothing. There's and the elders and the activists and everyone, increase the knowledge base. There's nothing we can't do.
Okay, here's one that's a reasonable question. Could a dedicated rail system be constructed from songs inland that would either go under or over the 101 and take the waste to a bunker drilled into the hills that are owned by the Navy/government? It might be less expensive than building a bunker right next to the ocean, and it would eradicate threats from tsunami and saltwater. Now, I think that sounds like a tremendously common sense solution. Would anyone like to comment on why that isn't happening? Then I will.
Look at, please.
Moving any nuclear waste off of San Onofre across that site boundary would literally require an act of Congress. And then it would be tied up in courts for years in all sorts of lawsuits that would try to prevent it from being taken from San Onofre to another repository, which, as we've discussed earlier, doesn't exist. There's no such thing at this time. So the general consensus is that any kind of an effort to move that nuclear waste is going to be so tied up in the court system that it would involve literally lifetimes of litigation. So we need probably an act of Congress to do it. And even that would make it very difficult.
Agree with Charles.
Let's see. Okay, I think it's time to wrap this up. I thank you all for listening carefully and asking such great questions. If I can remind you that you can go to the website for this seminar, grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre, and we've got all sorts of great information there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gary, Kathy, Paul, and I'd especially like to thank Doug Wood for doing a tremendous amount of work at grassrootsinfo.org and making this whole presentation possible on a technological level and on a scheduling level, and doing all the other stuff that you've done to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, too.
Good night.
Yes, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Charles,
everyone.
Doug, and everyone for participating and assisting us. This was a monumental task, and we all did it with our own time and effort. And, thank you, everybody, for doing this for us.